How does a company that controls over 60% of an entire country's natural gas consumption plunge from a positive 29 billion in retained economic value down to a negative 9 billion in a single year?
And then celebrate it, right?
Exactly.
Mm.
Celebrate it as this massive strategic victory.
It sounds like a total paradox.
Yeah.
But when you are managing a 30-year-old legacy energy grid, sometimes the most aggressive growth actually looks like a financial retreat on paper.
Right.
We are looking at a company that operates a 9,300-kilometer physical steel circulatory system,
Mm.
33 massive compressor plants pushing millions of cubic meters of gas every single day.
They're the undisputed giant of their region.
Yeah, exactly. And their 2022 financials tell this fascinating story about what it actually costs to future-proof an empire like that.
Okay, let's unpack this, because if you just glance at the top line revenues, it looks like, a slight contraction. They moved from 173 billion in 2021 down to 164 billion in 2022.
Right, a small dip.
Yeah, it's a dip, but it doesn't explain the really wild metric, that retained economic value number, going from almost 29 billion in the black to 9 billion in the red.
Yeah, that's the number that jumps out at you.
And for anyone not spending their weekends reading accounting textbooks, retained economic value is basically the wealth a company creates minus the wealth it distributes.
Right, what's left over.
Exactly. It's what's left in the vault after you pay your operating costs, your employees, your taxes, and, your capital providers.
So dropping to negative 9 billion sounds like a catastrophic leak in the system. But you're saying this is actually aggressive reinvestment.
Highly aggressive. I mean, if you dig into the cash flow, they didn't lose that money to operational inefficiency. They actively deployed it.
Okay, so where did it go?
Well, that drop was driven by a massive leap in two very specific areas. First, payments to capital providers jumped from nearly 19 billion to over 25 billion.
Wow. And second, their tax payments effectively doubled, soaring to over 36 billion. What's fascinating here is the underlying strategy. We're looking at a legacy utility company essentially doubling down on its own physical growth during a milestone anniversary year.
So they're just spending incredibly heavily to expand that physical infrastructure.
Precisely. When you build massive new pipelines, you draw down capital, you pay the interest to the banks financing it, and you pay the taxes associated with the sheer volume of that economic activity.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, they are choosing to take a negative retained value in the short term to secure a much larger physical footprint for the next 30 years.
So they're basically building the next decade of their business today.
Exactly.
But we can't really look at that aggressive spending in a vacuum, right? The
Yeah.
environment they were building in during 2022 was incredibly turbulent.
It was a perfect storm.
Yeah, I mean, you don't manage a 9,300-kilometer network without facing macroeconomic headwinds. So let's start with the most obvious one, which was the global energy shock driven by the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Because on the domestic front, the company actually saw gas demand rise by 2.1%, hitting 137 million cubic meters per day.
Which, on the surface, seems like a total windfall for a pipeline operator.
Mm,
More local demand should equal more volume moving through the network.
makes sense.
But the global context broke the normal mechanics of their market. The conflict caused an unprecedented, astronomical spike in global liquefied natural gas, or LNG, prices.
Right, the global market just went crazy.
Exactly. And this severely impacted the imports coming into the local coastal terminals. Because imported gas suddenly became just way too expensive to buy, the local electric sector couldn't get enough natural gas to run their turbines.
Oh, wow. So what did they do?
They were forced to substitute it with alternative, heavier, dirtier fuels like gas oil and fuel oil.
Wait, let me try to map this out and figure out the mechanics here. Because if they are in the business of moving gas and domestic demand is high, but global supply is constrained,
Right.
think of their pipeline network like a massive toll highway.
Okay, I like that.
If the massive cargo ships, the LNG imports, suddenly can't afford the docking fees at the port because global prices are too high, the overall volume of goods entering the highway system just drops.
Yep, the supply dries up.
Right. To compensate, the local factories, which in this case are the power plants, have to resort to burning whatever dirty fuel they have stored in the back lot just to keep the lights on.
Exactly.
It disrupts the normal, efficient flow of the primary product on the highway. Even if the local towns are screaming for deliveries, the trucks simply aren't entering the on-ramp.
That is a brilliant way to visualize it. You've nailed the exact operational friction there. The highway just doesn't function optimally if the international supply chain feeding it is paralyzed by price shocks.
It just gums up the whole works.
Exactly. It forces the whole energy grid to operate in a crisis management mode rather than an optimal state, which obviously strains the pipeline operator's ability to maximize their core asset.
And while they were navigating that massive geopolitical supply chain crisis, they also got hit by something entirely invisible.
Yes, the cyber attack.
Yeah. In the first quarter of 2022, this heavy metal, physically grounded infrastructure company suffered a cyber attack. It's jarring to wrap your head around, isn't it?
It really is.
You have millions of tons of steel buried in the earth, and it has to actively defend itself from digital code.
Well, it is the new reality of heavy industry. We have to draw a line here between information technology, IT, and operational technology, OT.
Right, so IT is like your emails, your payroll, your administrative servers.
Exactly. And OT is the digital nervous system controlling the physical world. The sensors that read pipeline pressure, the digital commands that open and close those massive steel valves.
Okay, that makes sense.
Now, the company successfully mitigated this attack without adverse effects on their administrative infrastructure. But they didn't just quietly patch a firewall. It was a massive wake-up call regarding their OT vulnerabilities.
Because if a hacker gets into the OT side, they aren't trying to steal credit card numbers. They are trying to cause physical damage. Imagine if they blind the digital systems that monitor the pressure. The pipeline is pumping millions of cubic meters of gas, the pressure is building, but the screen in the control room says everything is totally fine.
It's terrifying.
Right. That leads to an overpressurization event, and suddenly your cyber problem is a very literal, very physical explosion.
Precisely. If you lose visibility on the metrics of a 9,300-kilometer gas pipeline, you are flying blind at supersonic speeds.
Wow.
That is why they immediately brought in outside experts to run a full top-to-bottom vulnerability analysis and designed a comprehensive remediation plan. Cybersecurity is no longer just an IT issue.
It's a fundamental pillar of physical pipeline integrity.
Exactly.
So, despite wars disrupting their supply chains and hackers probing their firewalls, the company didn't just survive the year. They broke internal records and radically expanded their business model.
They really did.
Let's dig into the 3 key events of the year, because this is where that negative $9 billion in retained value really starts to show its purpose.
Okay, let's do it.
Event number 1, record production and direct exports. They hit an all-time internal record of nearly 128,000 tons of natural gasoline production.
Which is massive.
Yeah. But the real headline here is that they completely cut out the middlemen for the first time. They executed direct exports of liquefied petroleum gas straight to distributors in neighboring countries.
And just think about the operational gymnastics required to pull off that direct export pivot.
It's got to be complicated.
Oh, absolutely. When you stop using a middleman and start dealing directly with international distributors via truck, your on-the-ground logistics have to be flawless. Suddenly you have fleets of massive, highly flammable tanker trucks arriving at your facility.
Right, which sounds like a logistical nightmare.
They handle this volume safely. They actually implemented 24-hour truck loading shifts during their peak demand months. And this wasn't just a commercial decision to move product faster.
What was the main driver then?
The core mechanism here was safety. By running loading bays around the clock, they drastically reduced truck parking times on site.
Oh, I get it. If you have fewer idle trucks bottlenecked in a hazardous industrial zone, you mathematically lower the risk of industrial accidents.
Exactly. They aligned aggressive commercial growth perfectly with operational safety.
That's incredibly smart. Okay, moving on to event number 2, the midstream expansion. They didn't just build more pipes, they expanded their footprint into a massive local shale basin, adding 7 million cubic meters per day of conditioning capacity, alongside a 33-kilometer pipeline extension.
And that phrase, conditioning capacity, is key here.
Why is that?
Because raw gas coming out of shale isn't ready for the consumer. It's wet, it's full of impurities. By building the facilities to strip and condition that gas right at the source, they're cementing themselves not just as a transporter moving gas from point A to point B, but as an essential processor.
Capturing value right at the wellhead.
Precisely. They are moving upstream to secure their dominance.
Yeah.
But if you want to see how truly innovative their business model is becoming, we really have to look at their third key event. This is where they basically redefine what a pipeline company actually is.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Alongside that 33-kilometer pipeline extension in the shale basin, they laid down 33 kilometers of high-capacity fiber optic network.
It's wild.
They aren't just a gas company anymore. They signed major contracts to provide internet and data links to other energy producers operating out there in the remote desert.
Yeah,
It is exactly like the old railroad companies in the 19th century laying down telegraph lines right next to the train track.
that's a great comparison.
Right. They already own the continuous, legally permitted physical path through the wilderness. They are monetizing the physical path their pipelines take by becoming an internet service provider.
And the economics of this are just brilliant.
Mm.
If you want to lay a fiber optic cable across dozens of kilometers of desert, the cost isn't really the cable itself.
Oh, it's the digging, right?
Exactly. The exorbitant cost is securing the right-of-way, battling through the environmental permitting, and mobilizing the heavy machinery to dig a massive trench.
Which they were already doing anyway.
Right. This company already had to do the hardest, most expensive part to bury their steel pipe. Dropping a spool of glass fiber into that exact same trench before they cover it up is a marginal, almost negligible additional cost.
But the recurring revenue from leasing that data capacity to remote drilling rigs is just pure upside.
Pure upside.
It's an incredible pivot. But, you can't just drop 33 kilometers of new pipeline and fiber optics into a remote, delicate ecosystem without disrupting the land.
No, you definitely can't.
And that physical expansion triggers the biggest non-financial hurdle for heavy industry today, securing the license to operate.
Which brings us to their environmental, social, and governance highlights.
Exactly. And I want to frame this carefully because ESG often gets treated like corporate PR, like a way to justify a fossil fuel company's existence.
Right, a lot of greenwashing.
Yeah, but reading this report, it actually looks like hard-nosed operational risk mitigation. Let's start with the environmental pillar. They launched a new strategic environmental plan, and one specific engineering action caught my eye.
Oh, the solar panels.
Yes. They partnered with an external tech firm to build hybrid solar and wind systems to power the anti-corrosion technology on their pipelines.
This is such a fantastic look into the mechanics of pipeline maintenance. Steel buried in the earth will naturally interact with soil chemistry, lose electrons, and rust.
Which is obviously bad for a gas pipeline.
Very bad. To stop a pipeline from corroding and eventually leaking, engineers use a technique called cathodic protection.
Cathodic protection, okay.
Yeah, they essentially force a continuous, low-voltage electrical current through the metal pipeline. The electricity replaces the electrons the steel is losing, which completely halts the rust.
That's amazing. But here is the logistical nightmare, right? How do you provide constant, uninterrupted electricity to a pipeline buried in the middle of an uninhabited desert?
Exactly. Historically, companies had to install small, inefficient generators running on fossil fuels along the route, which required constant refueling and maintenance.
That sounds expensive.
It was. But by engineering bespoke solar panels and wind turbines specifically designed to generate that protective electrical current, they are solving a deeply technical physical degradation problem using zero-emission energy.
It is a tangible, ground-level application of environmental tech that's literally saving the company millions in maintenance.
Exactly. It's not just a PR move.
Now let's look at the social pillar because the numbers here are staggering. Their community investments didn't just grow, they exploded, jumping from about 11.6 million in 2021 to over 122 million in 2022.
A tenfold increase.
Yeah, and if you view that through a PR lens, it looks like, I don't know, random philanthropy. But if you view it through an operational lens, it's about securing that new 33-kilometer trench.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That massive budget increase was driven by a highly targeted initiative to provide concrete economic support and establish formal dialogue with the indigenous communities whose traditional lands intersect with the company's operational footprint.
Because when you are building critical infrastructure, local opposition isn't just a PR problem.
No, it is an existential operational threat.
Right.
A protest that blockades a pipeline construction site can cost a company millions in delays every single day.
Right.
So that 122 million isn't charity. It's the literal cost of securing deep, localized consensus.
It's a strategic investment in frictionless operations.
Precisely.
And internally, they recognized that the friction of the year was taking a toll on their own people. They didn't just focus on hard hats and steel-toed boots. They launched a comprehensive well-being program directly addressing the psychosocial health of their workers.
Which is so important.
Yeah, operating critical infrastructure during a year of global energy shocks, cyber threats, and aggressive expansion is incredibly stressful, and they formalized a safety net for mental fatigue.
And speaking of formalizing things, on the governance front, they reported that 100% of their employees reaccepted the code of ethics.
Now, let's be honest, nobody likes corporate compliance training.
Oh, it's the
It's
worst.
usually a giant legal PDF you just scroll to the bottom of and blindly click accept.
Yep.
But they actually innovated the mechanism here. They enforced a comprehension quiz to prove people actually read it, and they launched ABC Compliance, which is this series of short, highly engaging videos that explain the rules simply.
They treated ethics training like modern media consumption,
Exactly.
which is how you actually embed a culture of compliance rather than just legally covering the company's liabilities.
Right.
And that operational discipline, from solar-powered rust prevention to gamified compliance, sets the baseline for their future. Because when we look at their objectives and priorities for the next year, they are putting hard, verifiable numbers on their commitments.
They really are. Priority number 1 is setting hard environmental metrics. They have publicly committed to a 50% reduction in methane emissions by 2030 compared to their 2021 baseline.
Wow.
And they are aiming for a 50% recycling rate across all operations by 2026.
We really have to emphasize how difficult that methane target is. Methane reduction is the absolute gold standard for a natural gas company's credibility.
Because it's a potent greenhouse gas, right?
Exactly. It is far more potent than carbon dioxide in the short term. But how do you actually cut emissions by 50% across 9,300 kilometers of infrastructure?
I have no idea.
It requires massive capital. Older pipeline systems use the pressure of the gas itself to open and close pneumatic valves, which by design vents a tiny puff of methane every time they operate.
No, I didn't know that.
Yeah. To hit a 50% reduction, you have to physically send crews out to rip thousands of mechanical valves out of the desert and replace them with electric actuators.
And how do you power those electric valves in the middle of nowhere?
You need those solar panels we talked about
Oh,
earlier.
it all connects.
It's an incredibly complex operational web.
That perfectly illustrates why their retained economic value was negative. They are buying the equipment to overhaul the system.
Exactly.
Priority number 2 is just as critical, which is the water footprint. The report highlights that a staggering 77% of their operations are located in water-stressed areas.
Which is a huge operational risk.
Right. So their key priority is mapping their entire water footprint and committing to recovering 80% of their wastewater for irrigation by 2025.
Heavy industry requires massive amounts of water for cooling those massive compressor engines. In a water-stressed desert, you can't just draw fresh water, heat it up, and dump it.
No, definitely not.
Recovering 80% of wastewater requires building closed-loop cooling systems and reverse osmosis facilities right next to the pipelines.
That's a lot of infrastructure.
It is. By mapping their footprint, they are treating water with the exact same rigorous accounting standards as their financial capital. Because if a local reservoir dries up, a compressor station shuts down.
Water efficiency is now a critical operational safeguard against future droughts halting their facilities.
Exactly.
And that leads us perfectly into priority number 3, which is climate risk assessment.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is perhaps the most forward-looking initiative in their entire report.
Really? How so?
The company has explicitly budgeted to officially model out the physical risks of climate change. They're going to map out exactly how extreme weather anomalies, unprecedented floods, and wildfires could physically compromise their steel infrastructure.
Just try to imagine the scale of that risk management task. You are trying to protect a 9,300-kilometer continuous physical asset that crosses rivers, cuts through deserts, and climbs over mountains.
It's daunting.
You can't just move a pipeline out of the way of a flood. If a torrential, unprecedented downpour washes away the soil supporting a pipeline across a ravine, the sheer weight of the unsupported steel will just cause it to snap.
And that is exactly why the financial community is demanding this data. Institutional investors want to know, if a 100-year flood now happens every 10 years due to climate shifts, is your multi-million-dollar compressor station going to be underwater?
Right.
By officially budgeting to model topographical vulnerabilities and stress test elevations, they are taking climate change out of the Sustainability Department's PR brochures and dropping it right onto the desk of the chief risk officer.
So we've gone from the balance sheet all the way down to the physical soil holding up the pipes. Let's bring this deep dive to a close by summarizing the core journey of this company in 2022.
Sounds good.
Takeaway number one for me is the incredible evolution of the business model. They're no longer just a dumb toll road moving gas from point A to point B.
Not at all.
By pushing into direct exports, expanding conditioning capacity at the wellhead, and laying fiber optic cables, they're transforming into an integrated midstreamer and a remote internet provider.
Building on that, takeaway number 2 is their strategic financial resilience. They actively chose to invest heavily in capital projects, pay down the associated infrastructure costs, and absorb the massive tax burden.
Even though it tanked their retained economic value.
Exactly. Even though it resulted in a negative $9 billion in the short term, they recognize that you have to spend massive capital today to secure the physical future of the grid tomorrow. It is a masterclass in prioritizing long-term physical assets over short-term financial optics.
And takeaway number 3 is how they are grounding ESG in mechanical reality. They are moving far beyond corporate buzzwords to tangible, engineering-based actions.
Like the solar panels.
Exactly. Using bespoke solar panels to stop pipelines from rusting in the desert, deploying $122 million to secure operational consensus with indigenous communities, and officially budgeting to model climate-induced flood risks. It's practical, hard-nosed sustainability.
Yeah.
So what does this all mean?
It means the definition of an energy infrastructure company is changing before our eyes. The engineering, financial, and social skills required to keep an energy grid alive for the next 30 years are fundamentally different and far more complex than what was required for the last 30 years.
Which leaves you with a final thought to ponder as we wrap up. Can a legacy pipeline company, no matter how dominant they are today, innovate fast enough to remain the backbone of the energy transition?
It's a tough question.
And as those severe climate risks we talked about accelerate, how will the physical map of our energy infrastructure actually have to change to survive the next century?
It is the defining multi-billion-dollar question for the entire heavy industry sector.
It really is. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We love pulling these complex industrial threads apart, and we warmly invite you to jump into the next exploration with us. Until then, keep questioning the numbers.